Hi.
Hi, I'm Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Savannah.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, I just wanted to practice sharing my screen because I have a double screen, so I know that sometimes
Yeah.
it can share the wrong one. Okay, so if I share two and then I do, um, okay. But see now, yes, this always happens. You can see what's coming next, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me swap it. You can still, okay. That is that. Oh,
Man, it says that we're already recording. Can we not? Hello, everyone.
Okay.
Great. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Sarah Merkel. She's one of only 5 lawyers in the world to have earned the credentials of Certified Professional Parliamentarian Teacher and Professional Registered Parliamentarian. As a professional parliamentarian, she advises organizations of all types and sizes on how to conduct business with efficiency and fairness, and how to make governance decisions that support strategic objectives. She's the founder and CEO of Civility LLC and is the editor of the blog The Law of Order, a resource on parliamentary procedure and the law, which seeks to provide accessible answers to organizations' most common governance questions. I highly recommend y'all check it out. So without further ado, please welcome Sarah Merkel.
well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm so happy to be with you today. And congratulations on signing up for a webinar on parliamentary procedure and business meeting rules. I am not confused about the fact that this is not necessarily a very sexy topic, but I will do my best today to make it as interesting as I can for you. And my goal is for you to understand enough of the basics that you feel like you can either run a business meeting or go to a business meeting and track with what is going on. So we all know that when people go to business meetings, and you want to get something done, a lot of times the procedure for how to get from point A to point B just becomes, you become kind of mired in it. And it's confusing and it seems unnecessary, and a lot of time can be wasted. And what I want for you is for you to see it as a tool that can really help your meetings be efficient and fair. I don't know what you think of when you think of parliamentary procedure or business meeting rules, things like making motions, making seconds, voting. But a lot of people, like I just said, think of it as sort of drudgery, as something that's overly complicated. And what I want you to think about it is, I want you to think about it as a tool for efficiency and fairness. It's not something that we beat people over the head with. It's not some sort of like moral code. It's just a set of rules that help you from get to point A to point B in a meeting. When you drove to work today, or when you picked up your child from school, you followed a set of rules to get there as efficiently and safely as possible. The rules of the road. Parliamentary procedure is just the rules of the road for business meetings. They're also a set of rules that help a group come together to make decisions. So if you're sitting on your couch at night watching Netflix and you decide that you want ice cream from the freezer, you just make that decision. You get up by yourself, right? Like you get up off the couch, you go get the ice cream, you decide which kind you want, how much you want, and you eat it. That's you making a decision. But if your family is going to make a decision about where to go out to eat on Friday night and what movie to see, you have some sort of rules by which you're going to make those decisions. Now, they're probably unwritten, but there's probably somebody that has veto power. There's probably somebody that doesn't get to decide because they decided last time. You may have a system for how the decision is made, and and uh, and that's how your family comes together to make a decision. Well, now if we broaden that to a group of people who don't work together, they're not related, they're involved in an organization like NAWIC, and you want to make a decision for that organization, we have to ask, like, how is that group of people going to come together to make a decision? Each person can't just do what they want, because you have to decide as a group what the group will do. And you've joined NAWIC and you're involved in NAWIC because you believe in its mission, and you as a group can do more for its mission than you can individually. And so how are we going to make decisions as a group to move that mission forward? Parliamentary procedure, business meeting rules are what help a group make a decision in that context. So today, we're going to give you a little overview here, and then we'll jump right in. And as we talk about different concepts, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I can see the chat. It will come to the hosts and the panelists, and I'll be happy to answer as many as I can. There's nothing worse than sitting through a presentation like this and being lost. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat. We'll just, I talk fast, so we'll just cover as much as we can.
Also, there's a worksheet in the chat that if everybody wants to access that, it's been dropped into the chat for you.
That's right. Thank you. Some people think of parliamentary procedure as a bit arbitrary, like that this guy named Robert of Robert's Rules of Order just sort of woke up in the middle of the night and wrote down a set of rules that everybody now follows. But that actually isn't the case. Parliamentary procedure is based on some foundational principles, and understanding those principles actually helps you understand the minutia. So there's three basic foundational principles. Number one, every member has basic rights. Every member has a right to information about what they're deciding on. Every member has a right to discuss it. Every member has a right to vote on it. If you think about some of the rules that you probably know, for example, think about the fact that you have to have a quorum at any business meeting. A minimum number of people have to be present for you to make a decision. Or think about the fact that you have to give notice of a meeting or notice of what you're going to do there, sometimes depending on what the action is. All of those principles fall under all of those rules fall under the basic principle of a right to information. Each person in your group has an equal right to information. You can't schedule a meeting and only tell certain people. You can't hold a meeting with only a few people and make a bunch of decisions. Along the same lines, you know probably that when you go to a meeting, if you want to close debate or end debate, it takes kind of a super majority vote, takes 2/3. Well, that's because every member there has an equal right to discussion. Every member, we don't have to hear what every member wants to say on every topic, but every member does have a right to discuss. And so if we're going to cut that off by closing debate, it takes 2/3. And every member has a right to vote. Your vote is yours to cast. It's also yours to not cast if you want to abstain. Principle number 2 is that the majority rules. So when you join a group, you agree that whatever the majority decides is what the group will do. And that's very difficult for some people because they think that if they don't agree with the majority, they somehow have to kind of withdraw from the group or either stay in the group and be really vocal about how they disagree. And you have to walk a fine line there and recognize that there's no person that will always agree with everything that a group does, but you join the group because you believe you believe in the mission and you believe that you can accomplish more for the mission as a group than as one person. On the flip side of the coin, the minority has rights. So we don't come into a meeting just because we have the majority view and railroad people or not let them discuss, not recognize their basic rights. I like to tell clients that you may be in the majority today on an issue and in the minority tomorrow. So it's always, or on the next issue in the same meeting. So it's always important to treat people with respect but to recognize that the majority rules, the minority does have rights. When we talk about business meeting rules, it's important to understand which rules apply at which times. So at the very top of the hierarchy of rules, we have statutes, laws. So federal and state laws that govern your organization. And sometimes you can contradict those laws. They give you a default provision, but also allow you to draft an internal document that would overrule that default provision, but sometimes not. And so it's good to be aware if you're in a leadership position, what statutes apply. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to kind of know all the ins and outs, but it is good to know like what state are we incorporated in, what rules, what laws apply to us in this setting. Then you have your charter or your articles of incorporation. So these are the documents that give your group a right to exist. For some of you who are in chapter leadership, you probably have some sort of chapter like authorizing document from national that gives your chapter the ability to exist as a NAWIC chapter. Right below that, you have your bylaws. And the bylaws are what give an organization its general structure. I like to think of it as the frame of a house, with your statutes and your charter or articles of incorporation as the foundation of the house, and then your bylaws as the frame of the house. Now, I realize I'm talking to people who work in construction, so I'm not going to try to carry the analogy too far, except to say that I do know when you look at the frame of a house, you know enough to know where the rooms are. But you don't know what color the wallpaper is going to be. You don't know what or what color the paint is going to be, or what the wallpaper is going to look like, or what the tile is going to look like. And that's the same when it comes to bylaws. You want to describe the general structure of the organization, like how do you become a member? What officers do we have? What does the board of directors look like? How do you get on the board of directors? Do we have meetings? When do we have meetings? How do we have meetings? But you don't need to go so granular to say something like, if when we vote for our board of directors, here's exactly how we're going to count the ballots. Or when we hold a meeting, here's exactly how we're going to debate and vote on different motions. All of that information is more granular than you would want to put in your bylaws, in part because that's not what bylaws are for, but also practically bylaws are very difficult to change. So the more detailed that you make them, the more difficult it actually becomes to apply them as an organization grows and changes if you have too much detail in them. So you want it to be a general structure. Next, you have what we call a parliamentary authority. So a book of business meeting rules. Business meeting rules are known as parliamentary procedure. You can guess that they are derived from rules of parliament. And those rules are lumped together into something we call a parliamentary authority. The one that NAWIC uses is called Robert's Rules of Order, and it is definitely the most ubiquitous one, but there are other options. There are other rule books out there. This is what Robert's Rules of Order, my camera's going to play with me a little bit, but this is what Robert's Rules of Order looks like. It's great bedtime reading if you're having trouble falling asleep. I'll show you this. This is how it started when it was first written. It was about this size. So it's grown a lot over the years, in large part because lawyers have gotten involved. And it's just not something that you need to feel pressure to memorize, but it is something that if you're going to cite it in a meeting or you maintain a posture that you know it really well, it is important that you probably have at least purchased the book and looked at the book. There are some good, it is something that a layperson can understand just fine, but if you want something that maybe feels a little bit more accessible, The Idiot's Guide to Robert's Rules Fast Track is probably the best thing out there. It's written by a man named Jim Slaughter. And so Idiot's Guide to Robert's Rules Fast Track, if you're looking for kind of a ready reference type tool. What we don't do is we don't ever let Robert's rules or whatever parliamentary authority you've chosen supersede the bylaws. They can elaborate on the bylaws, but you wouldn't ever assert that book as sort of trumping the bylaws. Also, it's important to know that if you don't like some of the rules in Robert's Rules, which is completely fine, some of them actually are not that helpful, you can adopt your own. So I have clients that will adopt a set of special rules that contradict Robert's Rules or supplement Robert's Rules in some way that they basically want to customize it at some level for their organization. And it might just be one or two rules that you want to do that with. A good example is that Robert's Rule says that every person can debate 2 times on each motion, 10 minutes each time. And that's just a very long time. Most people don't need 10 minutes for their remarks, and people who take 10 minutes for their remarks maybe shouldn't sometimes. So sometimes it's good to adopt a special rule that says each person can speak 2 times, 2 minutes each time, something like that. So that's an example, but there's other good candidates for that as well. And then below that, we have standing rules, which I won't talk about a ton because they're not super applicable to what you're doing. And then we also have custom, which is, of course, we do this because we've always done it that way. And that is completely fine as long as it doesn't contradict anything higher in the hierarchy. And if it does, then you just have a choice to make. Either you let it go and you follow the rules that are above it, or you adopt a special rule to codify it and follow the custom now as a codified rule. All right, so that gives you sort of a general idea of how rules work together and where Robert's Rules of Order fits in. And now we're going to spend some time talking about how Robert's Rules of Order and other parliamentary authorities help you actually get something done in a meeting. When we talk about getting something done in a business meeting, what we're talking about is how is this organization going to move? How is it as an entity going to move forward? And that is done through something called a motion. So not emotions, which we all know are always prevalent, but just motions. So it's how does an organization take motion? How does it move forward? A motion is a formal proposal by a member that a group take action. It starts with the words, I move that. So sometimes you'll hear someone say resolved, and then they'll make their motion, or sometimes you'll hear someone say, it has been moved, or I make a motion that. But if you're in a chapter meeting and you want to make a motion, I just recommend that you start with the words, I move that. Don't start with the words I've been thinking about, or I sure hope we can, or I have a great idea. Get your idea. I'm sure it's great. So get that idea into a concise statement that is a proposal for the group to consider, and put the words I move that at the beginning. A main motion, so there's lots of different kinds of motions, but main motions are motions that are proposals of substance. So they would usually directly relate to the organization's mission, not to the procedure of how we're going to run the meeting. When you go to make a motion, and this infographic is also in the handout that you've downloaded. So if it's easier for you to look at it there, just know it's also there. When you go to make a motion, the first thing that you want to do is be recognized. So this sometimes involves raising your hand. This sometimes involves going to a microphone. But the point is, you don't just sort of yell out and start talking, even if you're in a small boardroom or small committee. In some ways, it almost becomes more important there, because the conversation in a smaller group can kind of easily devolve into something that's inefficient. But we know that can happen in a larger group too. So you want to seek recognition. And you do that by raising your hand, going to a microphone, and you would say, Mr. President, Madam President. And that's actually not, the exact words that you use are not all that important. But it is important that you seek recognition. And the chairperson is going to say back to you, the chair recognizes the member. Now, if you're chairing a meeting of any size and you're wanting to convey that you're impartial, now nobody's actually impartial because we're all human, but when you chair a meeting, you're adopting a role of professional neutrality. So you may not agree with the ideas out there, but you have to maintain a position of impartiality in order to lead that meeting. And that's part of being a chairperson. So when you're actually presiding, not when you're like, so if you're president of your chapter, you don't have to maintain a position of impartiality on all issues outside of the meeting. It's just when you adopt the role of the presiding officer of that meeting, then you adopt a professional neutrality towards what is going on in that meeting. So you do not debate. And when you recognize people, you recognize every person the same way. So when someone comes to the microphone, you would say the chair recognizes the member, not the chair recognizes Sarah, unless you know everyone's name. And then you could recognize everyone by name. But if you don't know everyone's name, then you just recognize them by the chair recognizes the member. Now that may seem really small, and it actually is really small if there's a lot of collegiality and everyone agrees on things. Then that kind of thing really doesn't matter practically that much. But if there's a heated topic or there's a lot of disagreement, then that kind of thing can actually make a big difference to people, because they feel like, because you recognize Sarah by name and now you're recognizing me by just saying the member, they feel slightly marginalized, whether you meant to do it or not. So these are ways to keep your professional neutrality apparent to folks, and to help smooth things if the meeting is, if you're discussing a difficult topic. So you've been recognized, and now you're going to make your motion, and you're going to start with the words, "I move that." And you might say, "I move that we organize an event in March to raise awareness and funds for our capital campaign." And the next thing that's going to happen is someone's going to yell out the word "second." And all that means is, I am a second person at this meeting who thinks this topic is worth the group's time. It does not mean I am a second person who thinks this is a great idea. So it is not a sign of agreement. And that's probably one of the top things that's most misunderstood in parliamentary procedure, is people think that the seconder is agreeing. And it's not. It's just simply a sign that you think the topic is worth the group's time. You may think it's the worst idea you've ever heard, but you want the group to debate it and go on record as defeating it, because that serves your interests, to have it debated and defeated. So we don't ever have to ask the seconder for permission for anything. You do not have to put the seconder's name in the minutes. And the seconder doesn't have to seek recognition. He or she can just yell it out. And now we know that there's two people in the room who think that this topic is worth the group's time. We don't just let one person control the group. So now that the motion has been seconded, the chair should then repeat it back to the group. And the chair will say, "It has been moved and seconded that we organize an event in March to raise awareness and funds for our capital campaign. Is there any discussion?" And this is an important point in the cycle. In the moment, it will seem probably a little laborious, but it's an important point in the cycle because, number one, it gets everybody on the same page. We all know that sometimes in meetings, a person will make a motion and then there might be like a little bit of dialogue on the side, and we tease out the words for just a minute, and then it actually gets in its right form. And during that moment, during those few moments, you've got people checking their phone, you've got people who check out for a minute, you've people who are just confused, and all of that's fine. So the chair will exercise her role to get everybody on the same page. From a parliamentary procedure standpoint, it's very important because this is the moment in time when the motion passes from the ownership of the person who made it, to the group. So when you make a motion and it gets seconded, before the chair repeats it, you own it. So maybe I stand up and say, "I move that we organize an event in June to raise awareness and funds for our capital campaign." And the person next to me is like, "No, Sarah, you got that wrong. Remember, we talked about it. We wanted it to be in March." Well, I still own that motion. And in that sort of quick moment of time, I can correct myself. Or maybe I make the motion and the group like audibly groans because they hate capital campaigns. And I realize, oh, this is a really bad idea and it's going to waste the group's time to debate it. Well, I can withdraw it. I can pull it back. So in this, it's a short moment in time, but it is a moment in time when you still own the motion. You have latitude over what happens to it. But after the chair repeats it, now the chair is going to ask if there's discussion, and you're going to debate it, and the group's going to invest in it. So if you want to make changes to it, like amendments, you got to get the group's permission because it belongs to the group. Or if you want to withdraw it, you've got to get the group's permission because it belongs to the group. So the chair will repeat it, and then the chair will ask, "Is there any discussion?" So as a chair, you're always telling the group what just happened and asking the group what they want to do next. So it has been moved and seconded that we organize an event in March to raise awareness and funds for our capital campaign. Is there any discussion? Then you recognize people, ideally pro and con, alternating pro and con, until no one wants to discuss anymore, or until a time limit that you have set for debate in advance runs out. And then you will ask the group, "Are you ready to vote?" Or, "Seeing no further discussion, we will now take a vote." And I'll just pause there, make sure that we don't have any questions, folks thinking about anything. All right, again, this graphic is in your handout. So let's talk a little bit about how to facilitate discussion during that discussion period. If you're in a smaller group, like 20 people or less, often what happens during discussion is people just sort of speak at will. And I'd like to encourage you to try to develop some method of organizing that discussion. If you're in a larger group, the same thing can happen, although a little bit less likely. what you're trying to do is have people show you, am I pro or con? So if you're in a small group, you might give people like a green or red index card. Everybody gets one when they come in, and they can, they can raise it, and you can see, okay, I'm gonna go around the room and alternate pro and con. If you're in a larger group, sometimes groups actually they'll put a microphone at the front, or with a green and red piece of construction paper on it. So the green and red is something that is very easily understood by people, but find a way to organize the discussion, and so that it's not just folks talking over one another. As I said at the beginning, you should recognize people the same way every time. So the chair recognizes Sarah, the chair recognizes the member at microphone 1, the chair recognizes the member in line to speak in favor. Fairly early in my career, I saw that principle demonstrated really meaningfully. So I was helping a presiding officer that's probably one of the best presiding officers I've ever worked with, because he was always really steady, and he maintained that professional neutrality really well. And there was a man in the meetings of this group who had a lot of questions, and you can sort of count on him to always raise his hand and ask questions. And his name was Paul. And sometimes the questions were great, and sometimes actually they were kind of dumb. And sometimes he would wait until like 2 hours into the meeting, that point in time when everybody really just wants to go home, and you're kind of counting down the minutes, to ask a lot of questions. And I had so much respect for the man that was chairing those meetings, because he just never let on. And he was a person, I'm sure he was just as annoyed as the rest of us at Paul. But he would always just say, the chair recognizes Paul, or yes, Paul. And he did it in the same tone of voice that he did for everybody else, as if Paul had always had the best questions. And if you're leading meetings, adopting that sort of posture can do wonders for your group in building trust, because what the rest of us learned was, we could ask a question at a not so great time, or we could ask a not so great question, and we would be treated with respect and fairness, just as if we had asked the best question in the world. So I commend that practice to you if you're chairing meetings. How long do people get to speak? So I would recommend that you adopt some set of rules, a rule at the beginning of your meetings, or a rule that can kind of last across several meetings, that gives people a time limit. 2 minutes tends to be about right. So it's, in my line of work, I go to business meetings. That's what I'm doing. At least half of the days of the year, I'm sitting in a business meeting. So most people can make their points in 2 minutes or less, and after that amount of time, they start to ramble. So having some sort of time limit is really good, and then enforcing it consistently is key. So the way I do this is, you have a timer, obviously, and when someone's time has expired, you just say, the member's time has expired. You don't say your time's up. You don't sort of make it personal. It's just, the member's time has expired. And if you enforce it consistently, people are generally okay with that. It's when you enforce it inconsistently that then people, obviously for good reason, feel like they're being targeted. What if someone speaks without seeking recognition? So this tends to happen more often in a smaller group, where people start talking over one another. And what I typically do if I'm leading a meeting or working with someone who's leading a meeting is just have them say, oh, thank you so much, Sarah. We really, you have important comments. We really want to hear what you have to say. But several other people were in line to speak first. And once those people have spoken, we'll come back to you. We will hear from you. We want to hear from you, but we're just trying to have an efficient and fair process here. And then finally, what about statements that are factually misleading? So I've added this in the last couple of years to my presentation when I talk to groups about this topic, because it has become more and more of an issue. And my advice to you would be to look at the agenda of, if you're afraid about this, if you're fearful of this, to look at an agenda before you go to a meeting, and think about where this might be a problem. So it rarely catches folks by surprise. If you stop and think about it, and you look at the topics, you can probably guess that certain people are going to stand up and cite facts that aren't correct, or spin topics in a way that is not quite accurate. And so the best thing to do is just be prepared with your own factual information that can rebut that on the spot. Don't let it catch you off guard. All right, I'm going to move through the steps for taking a vote pretty quickly, in part because I know this is in your handout and you can go back and review it. If you do lead meetings, this is a great place to sort of boost your skills, because it can make a big difference in kind of the flow and the cadence of a meeting. But when you get to the end of a discussion on that cycle, what you want to do is tell the members it's time to vote. Say, seeing no more discussion, we will now take a vote. And then tell the members what they're voting on. So you've had a lot of debate. People have gotten lost. People have gone to the bathroom. People might not know what motion is on the floor anymore. So go ahead and repeat the motion that they're going to be voting on. And then ask for those in favor and those opposed. So we say all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say no. All those in favor stand, all those opposed be seated, all those opposed stand, or raise your hands. Don't say all those in favor say aye, all those opposed the same sign, because then you're asking people to vote yes when they really mean to vote no. You may be in chapter meetings or in your annual meeting, there may be standing votes or hand raised votes, and just know that just because you take a vote by standing or take a vote by raising hands does not mean you have to count the vote. It can be just a way that is more where you can better ascertain the people in favor and opposed than you can by voice, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to count it. You can, but you don't have to. Then you announce the results of the vote. So a lot of times people will say, all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say no, and then they'll be like, great, the next item of business is X. And I want you to work to close the loop and get everybody on the same page by saying something like, the ayes have it, the motion is adopted, and we will organize an event in March to raise awareness and funds for our capital campaign. So come full circle on that motion, close the loop on it, and then move to the next item of business. It probably seems strange, but for some reason, if you take a vote in this way and you do it the same way every time on every motion, it does bring a cadence to that part of the meeting and a flow that then it really helps the group track. Okay, we've been talking about main motions, and now we're going to talk about secondary motions. So if this is when you're sort of like maybe had enough parliamentary procedure for today or for the month or for the year, if you could just buckle up and hang in there, because this is a little bit of a difficult concept to understand, but it's an important one, and it's one that can sort of take your knowledge to the next level. So just to review, main motions are formal proposals that a group takes substantive action. Motions like the capital campaign example. So that's going to move the organization's, it's a motion of substance. It's going to move the organization's mission forward. Excuse me. Only one of those can be on the floor at the same, at a time. Okay, so if you're thinking about that cycle where you get recognized, you make the motion, it gets seconded, the chair repeats it. We call that, when the chair repeats it, we call that putting a motion on the floor. You're putting it out to the group for discussion. Only one main motion, only one motion of substance can be put on the floor at a time. So we're not going to talk about the capital campaign at the same time that we're talking about whether to buy the real estate next door. Those are two separate topics. We do one at a time. But while that main motion is on the floor, so while you're in the discussion part of the life cycle, you may have thoughts about kind of how that motion is considered or what its wording looks like. And those and so you may make a motion related to the procedure of how the main motion, the capital campaign motion, is considered. And we call these procedural motions secondary motions. They're made while a main motion is pending, while a main motion is on the floor, and they have to be considered and voted on before the main motion is considered and voted on. There are several types of main motion or secondary motions, but we're going to talk about mostly ones that are ranked. So hang in there. If you look at this list on the screen, this is all sorts of different types of secondary motions that you can make. At the bottom, you see the main motion, and then above it, you see something called postpone indefinitely. Now, we're not going to go through every one of these, But before your eyes glaze over, if you look at the list, you probably see some things that make sense and that you recognize. For example, if you go up to 3A and 3B, you see things about amendments. Well, we know what that is. That means that you're going to change the words of the main motion. If you go a little higher, you see commit or refer. Well, that means we want to refer this main motion about a capital campaign to a committee. Or you see lay on the table, or at the very top, you see adjourn. So as a baseline concept, understand that these are all things that you can sort of do while a main motion is on the floor. Now, you would make these motions during the point in time on that cycle when you're discussing the main motion. And when you look at this list on the screen, you will see that there are numbers next to each motion, and those are the numbers for how the motions are ranked. The ranking becomes important because you have to make them and deal with them in the order of the ranking. Now, there's no reason for you to remember the number, and there's actually really no reason for you to memorize the order unless you want to do this professionally. What's important is that you understand the concept. And the concept works like this. The closer a motion is to the main motion, the lower it is in the ranking, or if you want to know the official term, the order of precedence. Now, I know that you say that word precedence, but for some reason in parliamentary procedure, we say it precedence, and no one has ever been able to give me a good answer for why. But it really just means ranking. So the closer a motion is to the main motion, so the closer it is to the bottom of the list, the lower it is in that ranking. That makes sense, right? It's low, it's at the bottom of the list. The further removed it is from the main motion, the higher it is in the ranking. Motions are disposed of or dealt with beginning with the motion that's at the top. Let's think about it a different way, and then we'll do one practice so that you can see how it works. One way to think about this is to think about the ranking like a set of nesting dolls. So with the main motion being the smallest doll. I'm going to go back to the list because you all know what nesting dolls look like so that you can look at the list while I'm talking about it. So think of the main motion as the smallest doll. When you have a set of nesting dolls and you're holding that smallest doll and you're looking at all the dolls above it, you have many choices for what to put on that smallest doll, right? You don't have to pick the one that's the next one up, because they're all larger. So you could pick the very largest one and stack it on top. And this ranking works the same way. When you're sitting at that main motion, you can put anything on top of that main motion that's on the list above it. You don't have to work it up like a ladder step by step. Now, once you put a larger doll on top, just like with the set of nesting dolls, well, then you have to deal with that largest doll. You can't get back inside to put something in between, put a doll that's in between on top of that small doll until you deal with the big one, right? Because you can't get inside there. And it's the same with the list. So for example, if we had a main motion on the floor about a capital campaign and you're sitting out there thinking, we're not ready to vote on this. We don't have enough information. We don't know, how much money we raised in our last capital campaign. We haven't done the research. I think we should refer this to a committee. We should refer it to a special committee or a task force. So how are you going to do that? Well, if you look at the list, you could say, well, I'm going to get up and move that we refer this to a committee. So that doll, the refer to committee doll, stacks on top of the main motion, and your motion to refer to committee gets seconded. It gets debated. Should we refer this to a committee or should we not? And then it gets voted on. If the vote is yes, let's refer this to a committee, then the main motion goes with that big doll and it gets sent to a committee. And now you're back, the floor is clear and you can present another main motion. If it fails, then you unpack that doll and now you're back to the main motion and you're talking about the main motion. And then you can make anything above the main motion, any of the motions above the main motion, you can apply to it. So while the motion to refer to a committee is pending, is on the floor, you can't make any amendments to the main motion because they're in between. You could stack a larger doll on top. You could say, I think we should just table all of this. You could go larger, but you can't go smaller. All right. So As an example, if you had a main motion on the floor and someone moved to amend it, and then somebody could move to postpone it to a time in the future. Once that motion to postpone to a time in the future, that we talk about this at the next meeting, say, is made, then you can't make the motion to refer anymore because it's lower on the list. And you're going to debate whether to but you could make anything higher, and you're going to debate whether to postpone it to a certain time or not. If that passes, what are you going to do? You're going to postpone it to the next meeting or postpone it to later in this meeting. If it fails, you're going to go back to talking about the amendment. At that point in time, somebody could move to refer it to a committee or do any other motion that's higher on the list. Once we're done debating the amendment, then we're going to go back to debating the main motion. If the amendment was adopted, we'll debate the main motion as amended. If the amendment was defeated, then we'll debate the main motion as originally proposed. All right, I want to talk a little bit about some troublesome motions that just sort of always seem to trip people up that are on that list. And the first one is what we call previous question. So you have probably sat in a meeting where it's getting a little long, or you've been talking about a motion for a while, and somebody says, I call the question. Or somebody in the back corner says, question. And then everything kind of stops. And sometimes there's a vote, sometimes there's not. And you may be sitting there thinking like, what's going on? What does that even mean? Previous question means to close debate and vote immediately. That's all it means. It means that we're going to stop talking about the capital campaign in March and we're going to vote right now. It has to be made by a person who gets recognized. So it cannot be just sort of yelled out by a person who's tired of talking about this. Now, maybe they're tired of talking about it, but they have to get in line. They have to be recognized, and then they have to make their motion. It does require a second, but it is not debatable. So we don't debate whether to close debate. It requires 2/3 of the votes cast to be adopted. And this is because you're cutting off a basic right. Remember, at the very beginning of our time today, we talked about foundational principles. Every member has a basic right to discussion. And if you're going to cut that off, it requires a little bit more than what we might call a simple majority, 1/2+1 type of vote. If it's adopted, it means that you will have no more discussion, likely on the motion that's immediately on the floor, which could be an amendment. So maybe you're just tired of talking about the amendment and you want to get back to voting on talking about the main motion. You could just close debate on the amendment, or if you have an amendment and a main motion, you could close debate on both of those and just get right to a vote. So the way it would work is something like this. The member would come to the microphone and say, I move the previous question. If you're chairing a meeting, my advice to you is to repeat back what it actually means. So nobody says previous question in their day-to-day life, right? So if somebody comes to the microphone and says, I move the previous question, I would say back, and then there's a second, I would say back, it has been moved and seconded to close debate and vote immediately on the amendment, or has been moved and seconded to close debate and vote immediately on the main motion. All those in favor of closing debate, please stand or raise your hand. Thank you. Be seated. All those opposed, please stand or raise your hand. So I'm watching for 2/3. If it's close, if it's not close at all, then I don't need to count it. If it is close, I do count it. Make sure I have 2/3. The motion to close debate, the affirmative has it. The motion is adopted. The motion to close debate is adopted, and we will now vote immediately on the main motion to hold a capital campaign in March, to hold an event in March to raise awareness and funds for our capital campaign. So once that motion to close debate is adopted, then you vote immediately on the motion on which you close debate. Now, moving back, if I just go back to that list real quick, you can see that previous questions number 7 is pretty high up. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that a lot can happen in a meeting and you can still preserve your right to close debate. Whereas some of the things that are lower on the list, you kind of have to make right out of the gate if you're going to make them, because you don't want to get trumped by something that's higher. All right, that's previous question. Let's talk about how to postpone motions. So a lot of times in meetings, you'll hear someone say something like, I move to table a motion. And what they're trying to do in that moment is kill it, right? They like don't want to talk about this anymore, and they don't want there to be a vote on it. But that actually isn't what table does. So there's three ways to postpone a main motion. On the left, you see postpone indefinitely. And that means exactly what it says. You're postponing the main motion for an indefinite period of time. Like it's never going to come back unless somebody re-raises it as a main motion again. This is what people are trying to do when they say I move to table. This is what actually like kills a main motion, is to postpone it indefinitely. It is debatable, and it only takes a majority vote for adoption. On the far right of the screen, you have the motion to table. The motion to table is not a motion to kill, because it actually lays the main motion on a table. So maybe in your meeting, your motion is not a piece of paper, but in your mind, visualize it as a piece of paper. Is actually taking that motion and putting it on a table, and it stays on the table. It's not killed. It's not in the trash. And anyone can bring it back by moving to take it from the table. And they can do that at this meeting, or they can do it at the next meeting. That's how long it stays on the table. And then it goes in the trash. But it really is only supposed to be used when there's some sort of emergency or some sort of matter of urgency that needs to come up to the group. So you're talking about this capital campaign, and maybe your special speaker arrives, and you're talking about the capital campaign a lot longer than you thought you would be. And now you've got your special speaker here. Well, that's a good reason to table it. Set it aside on the table so the speaker can speak, and then bring it back from the table after the speaker speaks. Just know, don't use this if you're trying to kill it. The right one to use is the motion to postpone indefinitely. And don't think that you've actually killed it if you're successful, because it's sitting over there on the table. Now, in between the two, you have what we call a motion to postpone to a time certain, or a motion to postpone to a specific time. And this is when you postpone something and you actually know when it's going to come back. So you might say, I move that we postpone this until 3:30 p.m. this afternoon, because you know that there's going to be some significant reports in between now and then, maybe the finance committee report, and you want to see how that might impact the discussion on the capital campaign. Or you could say, I move that we postpone this until after the finance committee report. So you can attach a time to it, or you can attach a point in the agenda, on the agenda to it. You could also move to postpone it to the next meeting. What you can't do is postpone it to like a year from now. So you can only postpone something for 1 quarter's worth of time, is kind of the standard length of time. But it is a way to set aside an item, talk about it later, and know exactly when it's going to come back. And it also takes a majority vote, only a majority vote. So all of these take a majority vote. Table is not debatable, but the others are. So knowing this and going back to that chart, sorry to give you whiplash. There we go. Strategically, you can see that making the motion to postpone indefinitely would have to be done sort of right out of the gate. Why? Because it's low on the list. And so you might start debating a motion. Somebody makes the motion to amend. Well, now you can't move to postpone indefinitely anymore, right? Because you can't go lower than amend. You can't get back inside that doll. And that's purposeful, because Robert wants the group, if it's going to kill something, he kind of wants them to do it right away. He doesn't want the group to have invested a whole bunch of time into it and then kill it. And if you look at the list, you can see that lay on the table is very high. And when people use that to kill, it's a bit abusive, right? Because now the group has invested tons of time, and somebody can come along with this trump card and move to table it. So that's some of the rationale, in case you still think it's a bit arbitrary. All right, we're going to end with some time on amendments. So a lot of groups spend a significant portion of time doing amendments. and they get kind of mired in amendments. And so I want you to have a good understanding of how they work. I think of amendments kind of, I work up the page in my mind, kind of like that list. So that's why I've got the main motion at the bottom of your screen. So let's say you have a main motion that we sponsor a golf tournament and donate the funds to the Red Cross and a local homeless shelter. Now, you're sitting out there thinking, I don't like the Red Cross and I don't want to donate to the Red Cross. I think we should give this to the Special Olympics. Well, what are your choices? You can move to amend the motion by striking Red Cross and inserting Special Olympics. There are 3 ways to amend motions: striking words, inserting words, or striking and inserting words. So if you just wanted to strike words, you could strike "and a local homeless shelter," and the sentence would still make sense, right? If you wanted to insert words, you could insert "and Special Olympics," so give the funds to the Red Cross, comma, Special Olympics, and a local homeless shelter. But in this case, you just want to strike Red Cross and insert Special Olympics. So you get recognized and you say, I move to amend by striking Red Cross and inserting Special Olympics. And because you watched this class, you know that you have just put a nesting doll on top of the main motion. You've just put the amendment nesting doll on top. And so now we're looking for a second to that amendment, and we're going to discuss the amendment. So the chair will say it has been moved, striking Red Cross and inserting Special Olympics. Is there any discussion on the amendment? And when the chair asks that, it's important for the chair to say, is there any discussion on the amendment to strike Red Cross and insert Special Olympics? Because at that point in time, the main motion is no longer on the floor for discussion. It's only the amendment. So nobody should be standing up and saying, I don't like golf, or talking about how much they don't like golf or why they don't want to give money to the homeless. They're only talking about the difference between Special Olympics and Red Cross. Once you're done discussing the amendment, you take a vote. And if the amendment is adopted, the main motion now reads that we sponsor a golf tournament and donate the funds to the Special Olympics and a local homeless shelter. If the amendment is defeated, your main motion now reads that we sponsor a golf tournament and donate the funds to the Red Cross and a local homeless shelter, just like it was put on the floor initially. All right, now that's amendment number 1. You can also have an amendment to the amendment. So you can go up 2 levels. You can't have an amendment to the amendment to the amendment, just 2 levels. So for example, this is how it would look. You would say, I move that we sponsor a golf tournament and donate the funds to the Red Cross and a local homeless shelter. The first person moves to amend by striking Red Cross and inserting Special Olympics. Somebody else is sitting out there thinking, I don't really like the Special Olympics either. I want to give it to the United Way. So they make an amendment to the amendment to strike Special Olympics and insert United Way. Now the group is discussing the difference between Special Olympics and United Way. They're not talking about the Red Cross. They're not talking about golf tournaments. They're not talking about the homeless. They're just talking about the Special Olympics and the United Way. If that's adopted, if the amendment to the amendment is adopted, you're back to your amendment. So you've taken off one nesting doll, you're back to the second one. And your amendment now reads to strike Red Cross and insert United Way. See how that works? So the amendment to the amendment said strike Red Cross and insert United Way. It got adopted. So now your amendment says, or the amendment to the amendment says strike Special Olympics and insert United Way. It got adopted. So now your amendment says strike Red Cross and insert United Way. And you'll debate that. So the difference between Red Cross and United Way. And if that's adopted, your main motion says we sponsor a golf tournament and give the funds to the United Way. If it fails, you're back to where you started. Does that make sense? Are there questions? No, I'm talking fast. Okay, a couple things here about amendments. So sometimes after I talk about amendments like I just did with a group, maybe it feels a little exhausting to have to go through that process over and over and over. And I agree It can. I think if you're leading meetings, one thing to think about is how well developed a motion is before you get into the meeting. So sometimes you come into a meeting and you have, for example, you might have like a bylaw amendment, and that has been worked over really well and it's really well crafted. Usually in that sort of situation, you don't have so many amendments that it becomes nauseating. You don't like kind of get on this wheel of amendments. The less developed a motion is before it gets put on the floor in a meeting, the more likely it is to have a lot of amendments. And sometimes in that situation, it can be helpful to instead of using a really formal process, to instead use a process that we call informal discussion or informal consideration. And what this process does is it allows you to talk about an idea before you put a motion on the floor. Now you have to get the group's permission to do it. So you would say something like this: is there any objection to going into informal consideration or informal discussion? And you ask the group, is there any objection to doing this? And if someone objects, you just take a voice vote on whether to do it. And once you're in informal discussion, you get the group's agreement for some time limits. So you can just use the same like two times 2 minutes each time. And you say, before we put a motion on the floor about a capital campaign, the leadership just wanted to talk with you about this for a while and hear people's thoughts. And maybe you set an overall time limit. So we're going to do this for the next 15 minutes. And that kind of a process where you hear people's views without an official motion on the floor can often lead to then a really clear motion being drafted. So you have somebody who's skilled listening and thinking, okay, I'm going to take Sarah's viewpoint and Abba's viewpoint and Savannah's viewpoint, and I'm going to draft that into a motion that reflects what I'm hearing from the group. And then that motion often is a lot more well-crafted, and you end up kind of wasting less time because you've had the discussion ahead of time rather than putting kind of a half-baked motion on the floor and then getting mired in that amendment process. So that's just a trick of the trade that I've used. I have a client that I work with that's kind of a middle range board of like 15 to 20 people. And so they do this at every board meeting. And they have people submit topics ahead of time that are on their mind, things that they want to talk about, but maybe they don't really know what to do, or they don't know if they want to make a motion. And it gives the group or the board a chance to talk through an issue before they make a motion. And sometimes they talk through an issue and they realize they actually don't want to do anything about it. And the advantage there is that you haven't put a motion on the floor that then gets defeated, or that you have to feel like you have to vote down in order to get it off the floor. You've just talked about an idea. And then you can just say, I move that we close informal discussion. You don't have to end it by making a formal motion. For those of you that are chairs or leaders in your chapters or in your regions or at the national level, I just want to talk to you here just a little bit at the end about how to make the most of people's time at a meeting. So preparing is really important. One of the bad habits that people get into is they pull out the agenda from the last meeting and they kind of change the date at the top, and they don't really take time to think about how the meeting is going to flow, how to make good use of people's time. People are involved in organizations like yours because they really care about the mission. And one thing that can either diminish that or increase it is how meetings are used. And to the extent that people's time is used really well, it often can keep them invigorated and interested in being involved. It's when they feel like meetings are a waste of time that they get discouraged. So even though a meeting may seem laborious and there's maybe nothing controversial, making it an engaging time and using the time really efficiently can keep people engaged and invigorated. If there's controversial items, I always try to have talking points or a presiding script, things I want to say or don't say on close to me at the meeting. I don't wing it. Think through those things ahead of time, and always be thinking about how you can foster engagement during the meeting, even after the meeting. So going out for drinks after a meeting, finding a way to have those conversations in the hall. These are things that sometimes we've lost in a virtual setting that can really be maximized when you're in person. And they're very important. Sometimes you can accomplish more on the restroom break than you can in the actual business meeting. And so look for ways to maximize that. As we close today, if there are things you're confused about, questions you have, a lot of questions I can probably answer. You could wake me up in the middle of the night and I could answer them in my sleep. So don't struggle. If you've got questions, feel free to reach out. My email is there, my phone is there. I hope you would call. There's also a QR code, and the infographics that were on the screen today, you can download there, and you can also register for the blog through the QR code. The blog comes usually weekly. It's stuff that we've talked about today. It's not anything esoteric. It's just tips for how to run a meeting, how to keep things efficient. Thank you so much for attending today. I see somebody asked about the handout, and Savannah, if you can just put it in the chat one more time here at the end, so that everybody who joined can see it. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.